We are going to be talking and discussing again, looking from Proverbs 1, second week in Proverbs 1, but we're going to look at verses 20 to 33 this morning. And I would like to read them for you. Wisdom shouts in the street. In the public square, she raises her voice. Above the noisy crowd, she calls out. At the entrances of the city gates, she has her say. How long will you clueless people love your naivete? Mockers hold their mocking dear, and fools hate knowledge. You should respond when I correct you. Look, I'll pour out my spirit on you. I'll reveal my words to you. I invited you, but you rejected me. I stretched out my hand to you, but you paid no attention. You ignored all of my advice, and you didn't want me to correct you. So I'll laugh at your disaster. I'll make fun of you when dread comes over you, when terror hits you like a hurricane, and your disaster comes in like a tornado, when distress and oppression overcome you. Then they will call me, but I won't answer. They will seek me, but won't find me, because they hated knowledge and didn't choose the fear of the Lord. They didn't want my advice. They rejected all my corrections. They will eat from the fruit of their way, and they will be full of their own schemes. The immature will die because they turn away. Smugness will destroy fools. Those who obey me will dwell securely, untroubled by the dread of harm. It's all right. It's okay. Yes, I'm absolutely sure. I hear voices, and so do you. And I'm not talking about schizophrenia, although that could be the case. Over 1% of the U.S. population suffers from some form of schizophrenia. That is, 1 in every 100 people in the United States has some form of schizophrenia. And I know lots and lots of people with this mental illness. Several of my friends, even some of my pastoral colleagues have it. Lots of people, through no fault of their own, have schizophrenia. And one of the characteristics of schizophrenia, this brain disorder, is auditory hallucinations, which is a fancy way of saying that they at least occasionally hear voices that exist only in their minds. And most people with schizophrenia are more or less able to function, especially if there are some supportive and some understanding people around them. And by the way, not everybody who hears hallucinatory voices actually has schizophrenia. So if you hear voices, sometimes that does not mean you have schizophrenia. There are some other conditions that create hallucinatory voices as well. There are other ways that people hear voices that are not really there. And by the way, hearing voices does not mean that you are crazy. If you're hearing voices in your head sometimes, it's how you respond to the voices that determines whether you're crazy or not. I don't want to spend the morning playing psychiatrist, but I do want to suggest that most of us are hearing and struggling with voices, and that the voices are often real. And the real voices that are coming at us are may even render us even more dysfunctional than someone who has a severe form of schizophrenia, albeit in a slightly different way. So this morning, as we look at Proverbs 1, 20 to 33, we're going to be talking about voices. And verse 20, if you look there, wisdom shouts in the street, in the public square, she raises her voice. In the public square, she raises her voice. And this proverb is intended to be, or needs to be, received in the context of verses 8 through 19. And by the way, this is perhaps the most narrative you're going to find in the book of Proverbs. But you need to read this in the context of verses 8 through 19, where there are two other voices that are vying for attention. So if you start at verse 10, it says, my son, so you've got a father's voice. My son, don't let sinners entice you. Don't go when they say, thus begins the sinner's voice, come with us, let's set up a deadly ambush. Let's secretly wait for the innocent just for fun. Let's swallow up the living like the grave, whole like those who go down into the pit. We'll find all sorts of precious wealth. We'll fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot with us. We'll share our money. So you've got the voice of maturity that is warning about the voice of reckless youth. And that warning, that voice goes on through verse 19, where through a kind of a tag team maneuver, a new voice chimes in. The voice of wisdom. A voice personified as a woman. Verse 20. Wisdom shouts in the street, in the public square, she raises her voice. So the first thing that I want you to note this morning is that the voice of wisdom is radically feminine. If you're jotting these things on the message guide, this is the first thing. The voice of wisdom is radically feminine here. And I know that I'm going down a bit of a bunny trail, but it's because I think that it's worth the trip, and it's also a part of the overall message of the book of Proverbs. This is a big deal. Putting wisdom into the mouth of a woman. Especially given the ancient context where women were pretty powerless and relatively insignificant. At least the average woman was. They were insignificant. And Proverbs then significantly raises the stature of women. So here in chapter 1, the primary voice of wisdom is personified as female. And then if you jump all the way to the end of Proverbs in chapter 31, King Lemuel of Massa quotes his own mother in describing this amazing kind of entrepreneurial, faithful super wife who is a leader in the community in chapter 31. So Proverbs is like a sandwich on this matter. In the first chapter, wisdom is this female voice, and in the last chapter, wisdom is this female model of extreme competency. And in doing this, Proverbs is pushing the envelope and raising the stature of women. Now, it's not the modern feminist movement, but there's this subtle movement on the part of God to get the world to take women more seriously. To recognize that when He made us in His image, He did so as male and female together. And we see this emphasis, the same emphasis projected on even into the New Testament, where women become, as we've discussed and as we've looked in the Luke passages we read for the past several weeks, where women become the primary witnesses of the resurrection. Where then women serve as leaders and teachers in the church alongside the men. In Romans 16:8, where the woman Junius is called prominent among the apostles. In Acts 16, Lydia becomes the first European follower of Christ Jesus, and then she starts a church that meets in her house. There's definitely this biblical women's movement. Although it gets derailed in the post-apostolic church. As the church begins to accommodate the dominant culture of the Roman world, of the Roman Empire, there's kind of a legacy of over-accommodation here. And that has stifled the church for centuries. And my point is this. I just want us to take note of the significance of personifying wisdom as female. It's just this one thin layer of paint on a picture that the Bible is gradually and often subtly brushing onto this kind of canvas of redemption. I don't want us to get stuck here, but the first thing that I want us to note is that, note about wisdom in Proverbs 1:20-33, is that the voice of wisdom is radically feminine. It's not a radical, strident feminist, but it's radical feminine. Radically feminine. Secondly, I want us to note that the voice of wisdom is aggressively competing with a cacophony of voices. It's aggressively competing with a cacophony of voices. That's the vocabulary word of the week that you are hereby charged to use sometime at work or in your transactions this week. Cacophony. Verse 21, above the noisy crowd, she calls out at the entrances of the city gates. She has her say. Now, I see this as a picture of a street preacher. You have that image in your mind, standing on the corner, maybe waving a Bible, maybe wearing this revealing hand-painted sandwich board sign, and shouting out to the passerbys, most of whom scurry along quickly so as to avoid her shrill rhetoric. For there are obviously so many more pleasant and inviting voices out there. In the 1970s, Americans were exposed to 500 ads per day, on average. Today, anyone want to take a guess of how many ads that you're exposed to?
Per day?
The average American on the average day is exposed to, how many?
2,000.
2,000? Anyone else want to guess?
More than that?
More than that? 5,000.
Oh my gosh.
5,000. We've gone from 500 in the 70s to about 5,000 now. And each of these voices is vying for your attention. And even if the voice is positive, which it is often not, it is still adding to the noise, to the static, to this unending assault on the senses. And the pressure is on to fill in every inch of white space in your life, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, otherwise. It needs to be filled in with a sound, with a political statement, with a brand, with a marketing message. We're even adding to the graffiti by attaching corporate identities to public buildings and stadiums. I mean, we were doing this stadium thing for a while, and someone now is trying to expand it. Maybe we'll get into federal buildings that have Kraft cheese on them. And if some legislators get their way, into the public schools. And that's just the marketing side of things. It's how we think. If you get into any of the social media, which is more or less a necessity for connecting with the main flow of the emerging generations, the messages there are non-stop. On the occasional day that I'm up at 3 in the morning, it's not very often, but sometimes I end up there, the online messages are still coming at 3 in the morning. And they're coming rapid fire. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Google+, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, and probably about 100 other platforms which I can't remember. And I get so many emails and texts a day and they're almost all of them are wanting me to do something for someone that even if I worked for 30 hours a day, I could not respond to all of the input that's coming into my life through the social media channels. Then, if you add to that we now carry our telephones with us 24/7, and we feel naked panic if we forget our precious telephones at home or at work. You know, we have this. There's some new anxiety. There's some new, I'm sure, medical kind of condition that's caused by forgetting a phone. You know, people are in therapy for years because they forgot their phone someday. But we're worried that we might be missing an important text, we might be missing an important phone call, and everything is now so important or wanting to appear important in order to gain a hearing through the discordant clamor. So I'd suggest that the greatest skill that we can teach our children in the 21st century is that of selective listening. Selective listening. That would be the wise thing to do. That would be the wise thing. That would be the wise life skill to take on. And really that is what the voice of wisdom is all about here in Proverbs 1. She is preaching in the public square and at the entrance of the city gates, and she raises her voice above the clamor. She raises her voice above the sirens, the occupying protesters, the American Idol and knockoffs, the Foxy News, the fashion moguls, the YouTube images, the iTunes, the porn noise, the car noise, the blaring and booming bump bump radio noise, the inane cacophony. Above the noisy crowd, she calls out. At the entrance of the city gates, she has her say. Thirdly, we should note the voice of wisdom is graciously gushing.
Is what?
Graciously gushing. Graciously gushing. Lady Wisdom says that she is making a generous offer. She is pouring out her spirit, her breath. She's extending a hand, reaching out to those in need. And it's not as though wisdom is distant and unattainable or detached, or that there's only a limited amount of it. She's bending over backward to help and to share herself, and she's just gushing it with it. We all know people who have gushing personalities, don't we? They're super friendly people. They're always offering something. They're generous with their compliments, and perhaps even so to the point of making us feel a little bit uncomfortable or feeling guilty because we don't have the resources or the energy to reciprocate at the level that is being poured at us. Well, Lady Wisdom is a self-admitted gusher. She's that kind of person. She's a gusher. In verse 23, she says, you should respond when I correct you. She's strong. But then she says, look, I'll pour out my spirit on you. And the word used for pour here in verse 23 denotes this kind of uncontrolled gushing. It's uncontrolled gushing. It's like when the pipe breaks and just goes all over the place. She says, I'm going to pour out on you. And she's saying, I'm not holding back. I'm not metering this. I'm not governing this. But I'm generously, graciously pouring self out, all of herself out, more than can be imagined. And she says, I will reveal my words to you. So this is a picture of a fountain of wise words that are gushing forth. This is this incredible, generous offer that only a fool would ignore. But that's the point, right? That's what's happening. In spite of her generosity, people are ignoring. And verse 24, the bewildered Lady Wisdom says, I invited you, but you rejected me. I stretched out my hand to you, but you paid no attention. A woman scorned is dangerous, as we shall see. Number 4. The voice of wisdom says that cluelessness is inexcusable. The voice of wisdom says that cluelessness is inexcusable. Excuses are always on the tip of an imbecile's tongue. I wrote that proverb. Excuses are always on the tip of an imbecile's tongue. My dog ate my homework. My computer crashed before I could print out the paper I wrote. I had self-esteem issues brought on by all the bullying that I endured as a child. But she looked at me wrong, so everyone dislikes me. The politicians have destroyed my chances to advance in life. I didn't have much of an upbringing and had to figure things out on my own, the hard way. Excuses, excuses, excuses. And the fact is that excuses will only carry you so far, and even if you think that you have a legitimate excuse, quit using it. Excusing yourself is a bad habit to be in. It's to always be offering up excuses. If you offer up excuses, no one will ever take you seriously if you're any good at making excuses. Besides, excuses are anything but humble. Think about it. Now look at verse 25. You ignored all my advice, and you didn't want me to correct you. So I'll laugh at your disaster. I'll make fun of you when dread comes over you. Then, verse 27, when terror hits you like a hurricane and your disaster comes in like a tornado, when distress and oppression overcome you. It's sick humor. But sometimes, all you can do is laugh at the folly, or it will drive you crazy. Sometimes the excuses are wackier than the situations. And Lady Wisdom cannot help but laugh. That humor, however, does not diminish the sad consequence of tuning out the voice of Lady Wisdom. And this leads us right into the key point. Those who reject the voice of wisdom are doomed, but those who listen will prosper. Those who reject the voice of wisdom are doomed, but those who listen will prosper. Verse 28, then they will call me, but I won't answer. They will seek me, but won't find me, because they hated knowledge and didn't choose the fear of the Lord. They didn't want my advice. They rejected all of my corrections. They will eat from the fruit of their way, and they'll be full of their own schemes. It kind of reminds me of the English proverb, you are what you eat. You become what you eat. Verse 32, the immature will die because they turn away. Smugness will destroy fools. If you refuse to grow up, it's going to kill you. Now, remember, this whole discussion comes at the beginning of the book of Proverbs. It's a part of the introductory comments to this collection of Proverbs, to the 7 collections of Proverbs in the book. And one of the difficulties that we face is that there are so many voices out there that sometimes it's very difficult to recognize what's real and what's fake and what's worth listening to, even if you don't have schizophrenia. Sometimes it all comes at us with such intensity that we don't even try to tune out the voices of folly. It's just so hard to tune it out that we give up. And we throw our hands into the air and we start making excuses about how no one could possibly expect us to handle all of this. And we just do whatever seems most agreeable for the moment. Well, Lady Wisdom says, slow down, take a deep breath, don't panic, don't dig for an excuse. Stay calm, listen to me, and pay attention to the wisdom that's in the Proverbs. If you don't, you're doomed. And if you do, things will go well. So verse 30 says, those who obey me will dwell securely, untroubled by the dread of harm. That is, those who heed the voice of Lady Wisdom will do well, in spite of the nonsense that life throws at us. In other words, take the wisdom of Proverbs seriously. Give Lady Wisdom your ear, for she is the precursor of Christ Jesus himself, who is wisdom in the flesh. Lady Wisdom in Proverbs is a personification. And a personification is a literary device used to make a point. But Jesus is not a personification. He's real. He's a real embodied, the real embodiment of the wisdom of God. He's not this literary device. And we don't just relate to Jesus as a concept. We don't just relate to Jesus as a set of principles or proverbs, but as a real person with a real voice. And so think of it this way. If you go to a comedy show, and we, at the pastor's conference I was at a few weeks ago, they had a comedy show. They decided the pastors need to lighten up. So they brought in comedy for us. And if you go to a comedy show, the first person on stage is just there to warm things up for the main attraction, right? Lady Wisdom and her Proverbs are the warm-up act for Jesus. This is the warm-up act for Jesus, the wisdom warm-up. Does this mean that we could just as well skip the warm-up act? Well, no, it's there to get us ready to receive the main attraction. Right? There's an interesting comment in Luke 11:31, which is a reference to the Queen of Sheba and her relationship with Solomon, the collector of the Proverbs, where it says, the Queen of the South will rise up at the judgment with the people of this generation and condemn them, because she came from a distant land to hear Solomon's wisdom. And look, someone greater than Solomon is here. And then, if you skip down a few verses, in verse 49 in Luke 11, it says, where Jesus then refers to himself as the wisdom of God. Therefore God's wisdom is said, I will send prophets and apostles to them, and they will harass and kill some of them. But he's talking about himself. Yes, the Proverbs are wisdom from God, but in an even greater sense, that wisdom is personified in Jesus. Yes, learn the Proverbs, note, learn, and inwardly digest them so that you might become mature, convincing followers of Christ Jesus, for they ultimately point to Jesus, the wisdom of God. As James 1:5 says, wisdom will certainly be given to those who ask. And here it is in Proverbs, in a collected form, the true voice of Lady Wisdom speaking into your life, talking to you, getting you ready to receive the main voice. And that's good news. I have another Proverbs trading card for you. Anybody remember what was on last week's Proverbs trading card?
Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, but fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Very good. Very good. So, wisdom shouts in the street, in the public square she raises her voice.